Okay. I will try to be brief and speak slowly at the same time. So, look, I just want to say, firstly, thank you, Shura, to you and Rieti and Watanabe-san and everyone for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure. I've already actually learned tons from the last panel, so this has been a fantastic symposium so far. I just want to make a couple of points, and we can build on this in the discussion. I think one of the things I want to just make a point of is that there are different equities in the digital and data space amongst companies and amongst governments and people. And so the impacts, part of this is going to reflect that the impacts are going to be different amongst countries, at least so far from going digital and access to data. There are really fundamentally different values at stake in a way which are more sharp than we've traditionally been used to in the trade space. And I think increasingly security will be a core organizing principle of the digital space, where data flows and who and how we get access to technology. In the Asia Pacific region, in that context, there are growing data flow restrictions, and I think all this will underline the need for greater coordination amongst a subset of countries. Just moving to slide 1, I'm going to go through some of this quickly because it's fairly obvious. But data certainly is increasingly central to how a lot of technologies work. That rely on cross-border data flows. A lot of business models, particularly for large companies, just assume data flows. And so to the extent that restrictions bite, I don't think that there's been a real grappling with what this genuinely will mean for business models globally. Increasingly, though, this is very much about large businesses, this space at the moment. I think certainly it's an opportunity for small businesses, and I think the political sort of framing around small businesses matters. But even for small businesses, they're working internationally off platforms, right, like Amazon, like eBay, like Etsy, and it's the platforms which actually ultimately are responsible for dealing with all the data flow issues and the payments issues. And these platforms are large. So in many respects, it is very much large businesses which are using data, using digital technologies and taking advantage of it. And the innovation space, which we really need to spend probably a little bit more time talking about, is that's got us to this point where it's even worth worrying about data and digital technologies, has been built on a globally distributed innovation network. That's particularly true for artificial intelligence, which has used a lot of, China has been a big player in that space as well. And so what, cooperation and new rules look like in terms of its impact on innovation is something we need to think about, both in terms of spurring innovation and where it may actually hinder it as well. I just wanted to pull up this slide because this is a recent, very, very comprehensive survey done in the United States of use of essentially advanced technologies. It just underscores some of the points I was making before. If you see that adoption overall, even in the US, is quite low on average, but it is high and getting higher amongst large companies. So, large firms with 10,000 plus employees, over 60% use AI in some form or another, compared to around 5% for small businesses. And not only that, your ability to use AI builds on previous technologies such as big data, cloud computing, and the use of AI will be essential if you want to get into the next generation of technologies, robotics, and so forth. So these are iterative processes that businesses go through. There's a lot of training and learning that goes on, and it takes time for that to happen. I just want to pick up a little bit more on the equities bit and just make a couple of observations. One is that there is just a difference between large countries and small countries in this space. So if you're a large country, by that, I really just mean by population, not Australia with a lot of land, but a few people, you have access to a lot of data, right? So China, India, the United States, this is the whole impetus to some extent behind a lot of the EU attempt to get a digital single market up and running. Indonesia, Japan, countries with large populations can do a lot domestically before they have to worry about cross-border data flows. For a lot of other countries, that's just not true. As I said, digitization is happening at very different rates amongst businesses within countries, and this is something that's been understood for a while. But it means that you know, if you are an economy with large businesses and particularly global businesses, then your view towards the importance of cross-border data flows in particular changes, right? So, for instance, in the United States, I'll just give you one example. Amazon, Apple, Google, Microsoft and Facebook made up around 17% of the S&P in January last year. They now make up almost 25% of the S&P. So this is 5 companies that are all digital in the truest sense of the word, you know, make up a quarter of the US you know, S&P. So it really underscores, I think, you know, and why, you know, data flows are absolutely essential for the US. If you look at Japan, Japan's got a lot of, you know, less large companies, but multinationals, particularly in autos, and we do see data flows in manufacturing being certainly important. Australia's got large banks, so data flows in finance are absolutely crucial, but thinking through where those links are is important. The geopolitical issues we've spoken a bit about here, but it's going to be absolutely central to, I think, how we realistically think about what's achievable in terms of governance. The question, I think, for this administration is how they pivot from what's essentially been a sledgehammer approach to China to something a bit more nuanced and that builds cooperation with allies. I'm going to run through these slides very quickly. They can be made available, but they really are just some data analysis that we did last year, which picks up the growth in data flow restrictions in APEC. And you can see that we've essentially gone from 1 in 1988 to 73 in 2020. So that's a growth of over 300%. Most of them are more restrictive. So it's actually the more restrictive data flow impacts that have happened. There's a range of reasons for the drivers, but you essentially get a lot of it. There's privacy is a big one, but a lot of it's internet access control and security, which is sort of two sides of a similar coin, are essentially, you know, the majority of now drivers of data flow restrictions in APEC. And most of them are concentrated in China, Indonesia, Russia, and Vietnam. And you know, part of that reflects large, you know, in China, it's a large, you know, a large population with a lot of domestic data and very few companies that are going global, that rely on cross-border data flows. That's obviously, China's looking to change that. And I think that's an important point of leverage there. Or countries like Russia, which are essentially trying to close themselves off from the internet and so forth. So what to do? So this has been discussed, but there's a lot of areas where data flows are being discussed. AI is being discussed. I want to underscore the international standards discussions going on in ISO, IEEE, ITU is another crucial area where coordination and engagement is going to be increasingly essential. So here's my sort of here's my sort of final slide. So how do we build trust? So I think the data-free flow with trust has been a great starting point. Thank you, Japan, for shepherding that through. I think the economic and security mix now that is central to the China challenge and to digital more broadly means that, you know, we're going to be limited in what we can, how ambitious we can be globally. And I think this, you know, reinforces the need for a initial group of like-minded countries coming together and coordinating more effectively. I've just put up a couple of countries there. I think that, you know, that's, you know, up for discussion. I note that in the Financial Times today, 25 companies have come together and proposed a data and technology forum, and that included SoftBank, Microsoft, IBM, and others. And these are companies, but it underscores the momentum, I think, towards this idea of sort of a group of like-mindeds to coordinate. My 2 cents on that is it has to be multi-stakeholder. We have to avoid slipping into this idea of government officials driving this. It's going to be deeply problematic on multiple fronts if that's the case. The other thing is it needs to be leaders level, I think, to be effective and to act as a real coordinating mechanism for the other work that's going on in the other forums. So my vision is that you would continue to have the work going on in all these other forums. I think they remain important, they remain essential, but you'd have better coordination amongst like-minded at the leaders level to more effectively operate and prosecute interests in these other regional and other forum that's going on. And the final piece of that is the innovation piece. We need to avoid this becoming essentially a US-China issue only, particularly when it comes to AI. And part of that is it's been very bilaterally focused, but I think we'll see with this administration that it will be increasingly be globally focused as the US also orientates the need to support better R&D and innovation and uptake of these technologies in other parts of the globe where China is pushing out its own technologies and standards, whether through One Belt, One Road or digitally Silk Road, working more closely with the European Union, who's got big ambitions in terms of being a bigger player on digital. I think there's an effective innovation R&D alliance which can be built on there as well. But I think in terms of thinking about cooperation, what we can do in innovation and R&D in a real and practical sense must also be part of it. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Sharon.